Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our evening Dhamma session. Tonight we're answering questions. I'm answering questions. This week there's a lot of extra work for learning Chinese, and I'm learning French. Trying to finish up the last of a bachelor degree that I've been trying to get for, I don't know, 18 years, 19 years. So unfortunately that means I can't put 100% into teaching or practicing. And I think this week I might just not be broadcasting after tonight, which means not broadcasting for a while actually. So I'm going to say that until further notice, broadcasts are suspended after tonight. I guess I'll be going to visit my father in December, and then I'll be going to visit my mother after that, and I'll be back January 3rd. So I would expect that January 3rd is when I'll start picking up broadcasting. But I do have some idea to continue to do evening talks here informally for our meditators, but I think not to broadcast. It's just too much complication. So for our local audience, let's say I'll continue Monday, Wednesday, Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. You can come up here, but I'll just direct my teaching to you guys, and I won't be distracted by the internet, and it won't be long. But it'll just hopefully be related to your progress in the course, okay? Because the whole reason for giving these talks, the primary reason is for you guys. It's for people who are coming here and putting in the extra effort, the supreme effort to realize the core of the Buddha's teaching in this very life. So anyway, let's go with that for now, and everything always changes. So we'll see how things change. Okay, so the first question here got 11 upvotes. It's not going to get my upvote. It's not a bad question. In fact, a lot of the questions that I guess complain about are good questions. It's just I'm hoping generally that they're good questions that have been answered by my booklet. Now this question is a little bit different. I didn't remove it because it's got to be addressed. But the question is whether this person's situation can be solved through meditation. And I can't answer that question. That part of the question is not a good question. I mean, I think it's a good question. It's just not one that I or anyone really, besides the Buddha. I mean, it's my failing that I can't answer that. I have no idea. I have no clue, because I don't have that sort of level of wisdom that requires, something pretty profound to be able to see someone else's path and assess whether they are going to benefit from something. But to be fair, I don't think there were many arahants who could answer that question either. It's a very good question. It's just, perhaps I'd say not fair, or it's beyond my ken anyway. It's beyond my ability to respond. But related to that is whether aversion can be helped by meditation, and I mean that's where I would have hoped that the meditation booklet made a fairly clear claim that meditation helps with things like aversion, which is this problem. And then there's other questions here. So whether you should try and be mindful or whether you should quit your job. I guess, again, I'm going to say that it's not really my jurisdiction to answer that question. It's up to you. Your life is your life. I can lay down the facts that if you find a way to meditate more by leaving your job, if that helps, you'll get better results. But is it possible to meditate and work? It's possible. Is it going to work for you? I don't know. It depends whether you can make it work. The meditation is potent. It works. I'll make that strong claim, but whether it's going to work for you, I don't know. That's completely up to you and whether you actually put it into practice. Could you make it work? Is it possible to make it work? Absolutely, it's possible to make it work. Is it easier if you quit your job? Well, depends. It depends on whether that allows you to meditate more and to put more focus on your meditation, or whether it means you're struggling to survive and living under a bridge and that sort of thing. And I don't have any general comments about work aversion, which is I'm supposed to push this. Don't have any general comments about work aversion because it's dealing with aversion, which is really, I'd say, read the book if you haven't, and if you have, the answer that you want is through your practice. Put it into practice and get the answers that way. Every morning I practice Vipassana meditation, and my body parts start to move automatically, like I'm dancing. Should I let my body do whatever it likes, or should I control it? Yeah, generally, you try to note it and say to yourself, feeling, or shaking even. And if it doesn't stop, you would sort of say to yourself in your mind, stop, and make a firm determination to make it stop. But it's just practically because, the mind and the brain are organic things, and sometimes they need a good whack to get them back. Like a skipping record, you just give it a hit. So just firmly say to yourself, stop, and see if that works. Usually that works. You'd want it to stop, practically speaking, because it's distracting, and it involves certain mind states that get caught up in it, usually. If it's a purely physical act, then controlling it isn't necessary. What we would hope is that through the meditation practice, your nervous system would work itself out, because it's connected to the brain, which is connected to the mind. And so we'd expect that after a while it would stop. You'd be healed, but not always, not necessarily. Strange situations exist. We have people practicing meditation who have had strokes, people who have muscular dystrophy, that sort of thing. it's not going to heal any of this. But, and so such people have to practice in a specific way. So if you have epileptic seizures, for example, then you'd have to just try and be as mindful as you could during the seizure, if you're still conscious. So if it's purely physical, then there's no need to try and control, right? Okay, this is a lot of lengthy questions, which is not bad, but it's bad for me because I have to try and read them. So this is a question about different types of traditions, and bewildered by all the different lineages and traditions. So does it matter which one you choose, basically, right? Or is it not important? How do you find the one for you? So let's step back and look at the situation. I would say we've got people with various levels of understanding, right? So some paths are going to be inferior to others. I think generally speaking or broadly speaking. I think that is true. But of course, it's also true that they're going to be different, and that there are potentially different traditions, or different, let's not say traditions, different methods that are not inferior to each other. What I just don't want to see is where we say, oh, well, they're all leading to the same destination, so it doesn't matter which one you pick. No, it could very well be that one is generally speaking, and generally speaking is because it's always specific to the individual. Some individual could practice a very useless technique, or something that's useless to most people, and by practicing it, that person becomes enlightened much quicker than any other way, simply because of how complicated the whole process is. But generally speaking, if you were to somehow be able to test people for enlightenment, and you could do a sort of statistical analysis, you could see that, well, this path is much more efficient. Of course, that's difficult, it's near impossible, because how do you tell who got enlightened, right? How do you tell whether someone got results, and how do you measure results? It's very difficult. I mean, there are ways to observe, but they're imperfect and they're highly subjective, because everyone says their practice is the best, right? And it can't be true. I would say, I guess you'd probably want to argue that most really popular paths are similarly efficacious, or are perhaps a little bit inferior or superior, but not with any statistical significance, and you could really not, it's not easy to tell, because it still very much depends on the individuals who practice, right? So to that extent, it doesn't matter so much. Like if you take the two big Vipassana groups that call themselves Vipassana, you've got the Mahasi group and the Goenka group, and I think you'd have to say that they're fairly equally efficacious. I mean, I'm suspicious about the Goenka group personally, but that's because I belong to the Mahasi group. I really don't know enough about the Goenka path to be an expert and say have an expert opinion on it, but I tend to favor my own path. But I don't think my opinion is particularly valid, except to my followers who really appreciate it. But from an objective point of view, you'd have to say, well, no, he's biased because that's his technique and it's the one he knows. But since you're asking me, I do have to say I would recommend our tradition, right? How do you know which one's best for you? Well, is it Mahasi tradition? Then it's the best for you, just because that's what I think. But being a little more objective, and even having said that, I would say there's nothing really wrong with the Goenka tradition. They're not teaching bad things, except when they say that the Mahasi tradition, the noting aspect, the use of a mantra, gets in the way of your concentration, or whatever it is that they say, I don't know. They tend to say bad things about it, which, well, I would say right back, it's better, right? It's better to use a mantra. It's more powerful, more efficacious. So these kind of arguments. They don't do walking meditation. And you didn't ask specifically about a tradition, but this is an example, right? I would say, well, ours is better because it uses walking meditation. So these are things you want to look out for. Well, one does walking, one doesn't do walking. It's an interesting aspect of the different traditions, and so on, I encourage you to try the Mahasi tradition and see how powerful and useful it is. But does it matter? I mean, within those two traditions it doesn't matter so much, but you could also find a tradition that teaches all sorts of weird things. One of my professors many years ago at McMaster said, at the university, said, a friend of his, he was Buddhist, and he said a friend of his had a meditation teacher who got all his students together to practice a meditation to destroy their competition, like another meditation group who was, So there's that sort of tradition, and hopefully you're not into that, but it exists apparently. So no, not all traditions are alike, and yes, it certainly does matter, because the word meditation could mean pretty much anything to do with the mind. Again, I didn't push that button. Okay, this one is a good technical question, and it's a little bit roundabout, but when should you note thinking, or see? When should you note the senses, right? The objective experience, and when should you note the subjective experience, or the reaction, right? So you see something, and then you like it or dislike it. When should you note which? There's no cut and dried response or answer. It's not like now you should do this and now you should do that. Really, the answer is generally whatever's clearest. It doesn't matter so much. It's not magic whereby if you get the right sequence of noting, somehow you become enlightened. It's about learning about yourself, and all these aspects are aspects of yourself. Now, after a while, hopefully, your reactions become less. I mean, if you come and do an intensive course, you have very strong reactions, but by the end of the course, your reactions are pretty much gone, and you're very, very objective. So it's going to change over time. The hindrances, the reactions of liking and disliking are going to be reduced, because you're going to see how they're stressful, how they cause you stress, how they're useless, unhelpful, unbeneficial, harmful even. But I wouldn't worry about such questions. I just try to be mindful of whatever you can, because it's not easy to be mindful continuously. When you have these doubts, what you should do is be mindful of them as well. Doubting. I mean, there's 4 satipatthana for a reason. They're all valid. It's not one now and another one later. It's whatever one is clearest at that moment. And it doesn't really, there's no magical formula. I was very hurt by the unfair words of a person I hold in high esteem. Is it wrong speech to speak about bad things, basically, that other people do, right? So someone, I'm sorry, I'm not 100% clear, but it's fairly clear what you're asking is that when someone does something really bad, should you talk about it? Is talking about it wrong? Because it could hurt that person's reputation. I mean, it's a really good reason, and so on. So I think the answer has to be that speech is never wrong. There's no such thing as wrong speech in an ultimate sense, right? This is why we're studying the Abhidhamma now, to understand that when we say wrong speech, we're only really concerned with the intention behind it. If I say so-and-so is a real jerk, well, I just said that. So-and-so is a really terrible person. Those are just words. There's nothing wrong with them. I just said them, right? But if I said so-and-so kills babies and eats them, right? If that person doesn't actually kill babies and eat them, then that's a lie. So that's a sort of a wrong speech, because my intention, not because of actually what I said, but because my intention was to mislead the audience. If I said it about the person, suppose they didn't ever do this, and I said it about them with a malicious intent, hoping that my audience would really feel horrified about that person, and just be totally turned off and hate them, basically, right? React violently and shun them and think of them less, think less of them, then that wish and that desire is horrific, right? It's a terrible desire that I have. It's really incredibly corrupt. But it's that intention that's behind it. The words themselves are meaningless, right? Then you may say, well, I've just used bad speech because I really maybe grossed some people out when I talked about someone killing babies, but and there's something to that. You could argue that I'm being insensitive, right? Because I know that my audience is going to react violently, even though I could say, well, it's their fault, they're not being mindful. But that's not fair, because I know that my audience is going to react violently. So perhaps that was wrong speech, in the sense that I wasn't sensitive. Right? There is a sense of a certain sensitivity, where you don't want to just say whatever. We talk about being objective, and so it seems like Buddhists should just be okay with everything, but there is a sense of being sensitive to people's feelings as well. But all of this has to do with one's state of mind, right? One's clarity of mind. If one is I mean, the Buddha talked about eating babies, in fact, killing babies and eating them in certain circumstances, for the very purpose of shock value, to remind his followers about not to remind them, but to give them a sense of how austere they should be, basically, how unattached they should be to food. It's a long story, I've told it before, some of you have heard it, but the point being that speech is never wrong, it's the intentions behind it. So if you tell someone about someone else's bad behavior, it really depends what your intentions are. Why are you saying that? Is it because you want this person to get angry at that person? Then that's a bad intention. That's called divisive speech. It's the intention to create disharmony. If it's for the purpose that that person might get help, you want some help to help the person who's done the bad thing, then that's potentially a wholesome intention. The intention to help is always wholesome, right? Of course, it could be based on delusion. Maybe the person doesn't need help. Maybe the person didn't do anything wrong. In your case, it's most likely that they did. From the sounds of it, it was pretty extreme, but there are cases where we can be wrong. So then our intentions are based on delusion, which is also bad. There's lots of badness. And it sounds like you gave rise to some unwholesomeness by being sad and being revolted. Those are negative emotions, so you shouldn't certainly act out on them. The best thing to do in that case is to be mindful of them. You don't need to fix things. If suppose this person is doing bad things and it's affecting other people, right? This person is embezzling money, or suppose it's, let's say, just one example off the top of my head, this person is an investor. What do you call one of these people who you invest money with? And they're cheating people, right? And then one of your friends is going to go invest money with them, and you say, well, it'd be better if you don't invest money with them because, they cheat. Then you can say that's a good thing because you're trying to help the person. But it very much depends on what are your intentions at that time. If you get worried about the other person investing their money, maybe it's a bad thing. But if your intention is to make sure that bad deeds aren't done, then that's good, right? So if this person has the potential to do awful things, to try and, to some extent, prevent that is always going to be, to some extent it's going to be wholesome because your intention is for the prevention of evil. But very much focus on your reaction. You don't have to fix the world. You don't have to fix anything but your own mind. The world's never going to be fixed. There's always going to be more and more people with more and more defilements. You don't have to keep silent, though. Words aren't wrong. It's not going to be wrong speech just to say something. It's all going to be about your intention, and often it's messy, right? It's you may not get it right. You may say something wrong, and then you'll learn from it. It's always easiest not to say anything. And so generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb is that if you don't know, if you're not confident that it's right to speak, staying silent is better for your mental health. Would it not possible, so there's different interpretations of the Buddha's words, would it not be possible to get things cleared up by simply asking an arahant? Well, yeah, sure, but who's an arahant? And who's going to say who's an arahant? Right? Because lots of different people seem to think that their teachers are arahants, or even that they themselves are arahants, when perhaps they're not. Is the first answer. The second answer said even an arahant can't clear up the Buddha's words, because arahants don't know all the things that the Buddha knew. So even an arahant could get something wrong, or just doesn't know the answer. Is this right? Is this what the Buddha taught? Is it not? An arahant may not even know. Nice try, though. Wouldn't be great. The only way would be to have a Buddha. Do appreciation, reverence come under metta? So by appreciation, you're talking about towards a monk, right? So reverence, where does reverence come under? Reverence, I think, comes under confidence, saddha, right? I mean, it's saddha we use in general Buddhism to talk about someone who has faith in someone else, but even from an Abhidhamma point of view, it's confidence. It's a sense of strength in your mind. Like when you think about the Buddha, your mind becomes strong. If you have great faith in the Buddha, your mind becomes strong. It's the same with God. If you have great faith in Jesus Christ or Allah or Vishnu or whatever, Krishna, your mind's going to become strong when you think of them. It's saddha, this sort of strengthening faculty. I'm meditating and practicing for 8 to 9 months. Sidesh, thank you. You're still with us. I'm very glad. How do you deal with people if they try to force you? So the question is, people are say you're acting like a zombie. Well, the world is a dream. The universe is like a dream. Being a human is like a dream. It's all artificial. There was a monk who told the Buddha he was going back to live with some very, very vicious people. The Buddha said, wow, they're very vicious. What are you going to do if they yell at you? He said, well, I'll just think to myself, these people are very, very kind, very, 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 very patient in that they don't hit me. And then Buddha said, well, what if they hit you? And he said, well, then I'll think to myself, these people are very, very nice in that they don't break my bones. And the Buddha said, well, what if they break your bones? And he said, well, then I'll think to myself, these people are very, very nice in that they don't kill me. And then the Buddha says, what if they kill you? And he said, well, then I'll think to myself, many enlightened beings have wished for someone, not wished exactly, have just waited for death. And now I have found death. And so I will be free from suffering as a result of the death, so it won't bother me. So how that relates to your situation is, eventually, you have to just put up with abuse. You have to put up with lots of things. People might hit you. People might throw you in jail. I was put in jail as a monk, and I don't think I was doing anything wrong. I wasn't. Eventually I was exonerated completely, but I was still thrown in jail. I told my teacher, and he said, oh, that's what it's like in non-Buddhist countries, basically, is what he said. That's their way of welcoming you. He was not very not very sympathetic. He said, what do you expect when you go to countries like that? Maybe I shouldn't say such things on the internet, but the world is a jungle. It's a jungle out there, and it's even more so when you start to be mindful, because most people aren't mindful. And I think that's important to say, is that most people not being mindful makes it very, very difficult to live in the world. It's not, we think of ordinary people as being normal, right? They're just normal people. They don't do anything wrong, but you become more sensitive as you practice meditation, and it's much harder to live amongst them because you're more sensitive. You realize how it affects you, and how wrong it is, the things people do. Before, you could just go along with it. Hey, we're going to go out drinking. Okay, I'll come with you. Or, hey, we're going to go dancing. Let's go dancing. And, you can't just go along with that anymore, because it's just futile. Because you don't have the delusion that leads people to dance, for example. I'm going to get in trouble for these. So hopefully that helps a little bit. So Sariputta says that Sanyupadana Khandha is dukkha. I thought that perceptions, there was not yet clinging, right? Okay, let's be clear. This is an important question. So what you're thinking is that suffering comes from reacting to things, right? If I like something or want something, it's going to lead me to suffering. So how could sanya therefore be a problem? Sanya is not a problem. Sanya is a problem in another way. It's a problem in the way that everything in the world is a problem. Everything in the world is a problem if you cling to it. That's one way of explaining it, right? There's another way. But the first way of explaining it is that if you cling to sanya, it's going to cause you problems, right? The cause of suffering is craving, is desire, is some kind of reaction to it, an attachment to it, or an attachment to something about it. So those things that we cling to are not worth clinging to. They're not satisfying. That's how we get this word. They're not able to make you happy. And the implication is that they're not able to make you happy by clinging to them. That's why we call them dukkha. That's one way of understanding it. When you call something suffering, what you mean to say is that that thing is not something that you should dive into and try and turn into a cause for happiness, because that thing is unable to make you happy. That's one way. So that's the understanding. But the second way of understanding it is that all things that arise are suffering, meaning they have nothing good about them. It's almost the same thing, actually. Maybe you can. But what I'm thinking of is, because the texts often talk about the rise and fall as being a bad thing. Everything is momentary, and that momentariness just makes it worthless. And worthless does mean not worth clinging to, but there is a sort of an intrinsic dukkha-ness, like a sense of being dukkha, in the sense of being like garbage, right? Specifically because of the rise and fall. And maybe it's just a more refined way of saying not worth clinging to. The better explanation is this thing arises and ceases, so of course it's not worth clinging to, because it's not going to last. It's nothing. It's a moment. And so sanya, being a moment, is nothing. It's useless, pointless. It's not a thing. It's useless, pointless, or it's a moment, a moment of experience that's meaningless. That's dukkha. It's considered to be stressful, right? It's not something that you can rely upon. It's not something that you can rest upon. It's not something that you can hold on to. So it's bad. The idea is to compare it to nibbana, which is something you can rest upon, is something you can rely upon, is something that is stable. The instability, right? Like if you have a chair and it's unstable, such that when you sit on it you might fall over, it might break, or it might tip over, then that's not a good chair, that's a bad chair. It's dukkha in that sense. Everything that arises and ceases is dukkha in that sense. Nanyatrang dukkha sambodhi, nanyatrang dukkha nirucchati. Nothing but suffering arises, nothing but suffering passes away. Is impermanence depend on intensity of craving? I don't understand. Does this mean someone has more craving, things get more impermanent? I would say that's a fair way of putting it. If someone has less craving, things are going to be more stable, more predictable, more satisfying, ironically. Whereas if someone has more craving, things become more chaotic, more stressful, more complicated. So if that's what you're asking, then the answer is yes. And that's all the questions tonight. I guess that's all for tonight then. Thank you all for coming out. Have a good night.